Welcome to our second lecture on Kantian Deontology. Now, it's probably important for me at this point to let you know a little bit about what deontology is versus, say, consequentialism. Deontology and consequentialism are two of the major forms of ethics in terms of broad categories. Consequentialist ethics focus on defining our ideas of the right based solely on consequences of our actions. Deontology, on the other hand, in general, is not going to look at the consequences of our actions, but is rather going to look at the actions themselves. So an action may have consequences which ultimately are beneficial or maladaptive, but that's not how we evaluate rightness or wrongness. We evaluate the action itself, not its consequences. Now, in our first lecture, we discussed a little bit about how Kant develops his theory from his focus on rationality. Again, the hallmark of what we see within Enlightenment thinking. In this lecture, we're going to take that perhaps a little further. We're going to see how Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative is a remarkably abstract, rational creature. Now remember that our theory of the structure of the theory involved our theory of the right, the categorical imperative, of which so far we've seen the humanity as an end in itself formulation. Our theory of the good focused on rational nature. That is, that we as entities which have both practical and theoretical rationality are able to base morality on that. And how do we do that? By looking at autonomy. Autonomy is our end in itself. That is, our intrinsic good. And remember that autonomy is simply our ability to make free choices. We'll get deeper into the moral value associated with this theory, that is, whether or not nature is to be praised or blamed, in our next lecture. So again, our theory in a nutshell so far. An action is right if and only if failing to perform it would fail to respect humanity. And our theory of the good, rational nature or dignity, is an end in itself, and thus it has unconditional intrinsic worth. Now Kant, after having given us the humanity as an end in itself formulation of the categorical imperative, which again tells us that we should treat other people as an end in themselves, not merely as a means, says, well, maybe that's not enough. So what he does is he ends up giving us a second version of the categorical imperative. Act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So that seems really clear, right? So we can go ahead and wrap up this lecture and move on. Okay, maybe not. The universal law formulation of the categorical imperative, according to Kant, says the same thing as the humanity as an end in itself formulation, or HEI. Clearly, the two things don't seem to be related. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see how Kant ends up bringing this together. So there's a lot of things here within this definition of the right that we need to unpack. So let's get a little deeper into it. Again, Kant argued that they're the same, but he argued that in essence, the universal law formulation ends up giving us a strict methodology. This methodology may end up working out significantly better as a decision-making procedure than the humanity as an end in itself formulation. If we can get a more determinate and consistent decision-making procedure through the universal law formulation, then this may end up being more useful to us than HEI. Now we're going to see that there's still a place for HEI in the end. Let's first discuss what a maxim is. Kant defines a maxim as a, quote, subjective principle of volition. Again, if it was easy and we could just simply leave it at that, we would. But basically what he's saying is that a maxim is a psychological state expressing our intention to do an action as well as our viewpoint about what the action is. So if we look at this, we can take a maxim and put it into a very general formula. I will X if when Y in order to Z. I will do something when the situation comes around that I need to do it in order to accomplish my goal. This basic formula is going to be something that we can continue to come back to as we discuss the universal law formulation. It's very important that you remember this. I will X if when Y in order to Z. Kant does make a few points about maxims. First off, Kant doesn't believe that we go around rehearsing maxims and then act on them. Kant does not believe that we are going to be in a position in our lives so where before, for example, I choose to eat a piece of pie versus eating a piece of fruit, that I'm going to rehearse that idea in my mind. Well, when I'm hungry, I'm going to eat a piece of pie in order to sate my hunger. We usually don't do that. That's important to note, because that does save us from some things that we saw, for example, in the challenges to utilitarianism. Remember, utilitarianism, one of the challenges was that there was this belief that we're going to go around and we have to evaluate all these different actions. And if we have to evaluate a ton of different actions, then we may end up losing the opportunity for the action. Kant's going to kind of cut that off at the beginning and say, we don't rehearse these things. Now, obviously, whenever we're in particular moral dilemmas, in particular cases of moral dilemmas, then we may find it beneficial to do so. Secondly, Kant believes that maxims may involve mistaken beliefs. A maxim does not necessarily have to be right in order for us to act on it. History is rife with this, and in fact, our personal histories are generally rife with this. How many times do we end up acting on incomplete information or on assumptions that we've made? Kant believes that mistaken beliefs are important here. And ultimately, we want to find correct beliefs. Timmons gives us an example. I might falsely believe that I have a bad heart and act accordingly, and thus be acting on a maxim that does not correctly represent my circumstances. I'll tell you, in my work as a psychotherapist, I see this often. Third, a maxim expresses our will to do something. Adopting it means that we will act to achieve our goal. This sounds very similar to a hypothetical imperative, but it's a little different, it's a little more complex. The reason why it's more complex is because we need to now dive into Kant's conception of the will. According to Kant, we both can directly will something and we can indirectly will something. If I directly will to accomplish something, then I'm ultimately doing something that I can voluntarily control. So I've got an example here of taking notes in class. You can choose to take notes or you can choose not to. You can directly will one or the other. Indirect willing involves setting oneself for an end that is not immediately in our control. For example, getting an A in my class. Getting an A in my class is not necessarily in your control. You can do a lot of things to help make that happen, but ultimately it's going to come down to have you done your work? Is it good quality work? Do you understand what we're discussing? Are you able to tell me? Are you able to use it? Things like that. So the goal of getting an A is not something that you can directly bring about, but it is something that you can work towards. Therefore, we may be able to say that it's not in your immediate control. Well, this idea about willing is important for Kant, because Kant believes that ultimately inconsistent willing is a major problem for ethics. If we inconsistently will, there are two ways we can do this. First, we can will to act in such a way that the idea of acting is self-contradictory. So, for example, trying to draw a four-sided triangle. Well, this is something that we're not going to be able to do, clearly. Secondly, when there's a conflict between different acts that we will. So, for example, if I support mothers against drunk driving, while I engage in drunken driving, I may be acting inconsistently, or may be willing my actions inconsistently. Now, the reason why it's important to test for inconsistent willing is because Kant believes that this is how we ultimately decide whether or not an action is worthwhile, that is, if an action can be universalized. Kant tells us about two different tests that we can use to determine the morality of an action. Both of these tests work on determining whether or not we can consistently will our maxim. In order to do that, we also have to distinguish between maxims of omission and commission. Again, what to do and what not to do associated with an action. Ultimately, when it comes to right conduct, and with regards to maxims of commission and omission, An action is obligatory if and only if one cannot universalize the maximum of omission associated with the act. An action is wrong if and only if one cannot universalize the maximum of commission associated with the act. And an action is optional if and only if one can universalize the maxims of commission and omission associated with the act. Now, this sounds really complex, so let's take a little deeper look at it. Kant gives us 4 different tests in the groundwork towards the metaphysics of morals. There's a groundwork on the metaphysics of morals. He talks about committing suicide, making false promises, letting one's talents rest, and refraining from helping others. Kant also believes that ultimately that we can distinguish between perfect and imperfect duties using this. Now, for the purpose of this class, we're not going to have to do that. But let's take a look at a couple of these tests. The false promise test is ultimately a test of conception. It's a test of that first form of inconsistent willing. Kant argues that it is impossible for us to consistently will a maxim that involves making false promises in order to obtain some good. So, for example, let's say that my maxim is, I will get money on a false promise whenever I am in need of money and have no other way of getting it. Now, Kant says that what we do at that point is we universalize it. We ask, what happens if everybody believes this? So we may be able to say that it mutates into a generalized form. Everyone will get money on a false promise whenever they're in need of money and have no other way of getting it. According to Kant, he states, quote, I then see at once that it could never hold as a universal law of nature and be consistent with itself, but must necessarily contradict itself. For the universality of a law that everyone, when he believes himself to be in need, could promise whatever he pleases with the intention of not keeping it would make the promise, in the end, one might have in itself impossible, since no one would believe what was promised him, but would laugh at all such expressions as vain pretenses. Ultimately, Kant believes that we cannot conceive of a false promise and conceive of it being maximized, that is, being universalized. If we can't universalize it, it violates duty and is therefore immoral. Kant calls this the contradiction and conception test, which indicates a violation of perfect duty. Again, a violation of our duty to avoid something. So let's look at one of his other tests. This is the refraining from helping test. This is illustrative of the second test that we use for a maxim. Basically, we're going to ask ourselves, can we consistently will this? So, for example, the person who is well off refuses to help someone despite being able to do so. So we may be able to say a universalized maxim looks like the following. Everyone will refrain from helping those in need whenever they are in a position to help and despite the fact they are well off. Well, if we look at this, there's nothing in here that contradicts itself in terms of its conception. So we can conceive of this, but we're going to ultimately argue that this fails to be willable consistently. So let's look at how he gets there. First, Kant believes that if we will this maxim, we're committed to the following. Everyone will refrain from helping me whenever they're in a position to help and despite the fact they are well off. Well, Kant believes that that ultimately conflicts with the demands of being a rational agent. As a rational agent, we have a kind of an obligation to ourselves for self-perfection. We've seen that with the duty to self-perfection. That may involve, for example, me taking actions that would sustain my life. Well, if I will that I be helped when others are in need, or when I'm in need and others are in a position to help me, that's consistent with being a rational agent. But if I will that I'm not going to help somebody when I'm in a position to help others, then I have a contradiction. Because in essence, if I say that everyone will refrain from helping me, then I'm saying that my ability, that is to be a rational agent, that is the demands of me as a rational agent, can be thrown out the window. And according to Kant, we can't do that. I'm ultimately not going to will self-harm. If we pass the contradiction and conception test, and fail this test, the contradiction and the will, we violate imperfect duty. And our imperfect duty, for example, in this case, is to help others. Now, two major notes that we should pay attention to. First off, this is not rule utilitarianism. Remember that rule utilitarianism looks at the consequences of adopting a rule. Universal law formulation, the categorical imperative, involves checking for inconsistency and willing. Consequences only matter to determine if a maxim passes the test, but doesn't determine the right, wrong, good, bad of the action. But it's also an important question to ask us whether or not it's possible that the humanities and end in the formulation gives us a moral criterion. That is, does it tell us why something is right or wrong? Whereas universal law gives us a decision-making procedure. The two things may be very closely related there. And that's how many philosophers look at Kant's insistence that these are the same thing and try to make sense of it. Now, there are some objections that we can raise towards Kant's tests. One is that we know that these tests can yield false negatives and false positives. So let's take a look at, for example, the false negative. The investor who will withdraw all of their money at a certain stock price. Now, ultimately, Seven states that one cannot consistently conceive of this maxim being a universal law of nature for reasons similar to those presented in connection with the case of false promising. If one attempts to imagine a world in which this maxim functions as a law, one ends up attempting to imagine a world in which everyone withdraws their money under the conditions specified. But since banks don't have the necessary funds on hand to support massive withdrawals, one is also attempting to imagine a world in which it is not the case that everyone in the circumstances in question withdraws money from the bank. Thus, because the maxim cannot be universalized, the action in the maxim is morally wrong. But surely adopting and acting on this maxim is not morally wrong, so the contradiction and conception test yields a false negative. Very similar with regards to the false positive. Imagine, for example, that we make a specific false promise to a specific person on a specific date. For example, I will get money on a false promise whenever it is March 8th and I can get it from someone named Igor 6 in order to buy a metal detector. Well, it seems like it passes the first test. And it seems like if I throw enough exceptions to the rule onto my maxim, well, I could end up with a positive. It may say that it's okay for me to do so. That's a problem. This brings us to the problem of relevant maxims. It seems that Kant doesn't really give us any clear criteria for determining what the correct maximum is in a situation, and that it does not specify what should be considered morally relevant information. This is extremely important. While Kant has given us a decision-making procedure and perhaps a moral criteria, he hasn't really given us anything to say how we should assess the situation to decide what's morally relevant. That could be a problem. Timmins writes, what we need from Kant is a principled reason for selecting one possible maxim for purposes of testing the morality of an action over the many others that also apply to the same action. Now, it may be possible to use the humanity as an end in itself formulation of the categorical imperative as a way of, again, determining moral constraint and what may be morally relevant. So maybe you'll ask, for example, how is it that I can respect autonomy with this action? Does this action respect autonomy? Well, that could possibly work.